Okay, let's get started. So, entrepreneurship today. One topic that follows on the heels of what we did last class. So just to remind you that we spent a great deal of time comparing static and dynamic approach to economics. And I try to somewhat convey to you the significance of static models of economics, such as perfect competition or evenly rotating economy in Ludwig von Mises's version for economic theory, and to show or to demonstrate or to develop a theme of the significance that equilibrating tendencies exert in a market economy. That even if you claim that entrepreneurship and dynamic change is what drives the process of economic change and innovation and progress, actually there is no progress without those disturbing tendencies, it's still very important to understand the equilibrating tendencies of stasis, tendencies of keeping the economy in the equilibrium, that we need those static theories in order to explain distribution of income, in order to understand the process of price formation when it comes to different factors of production. That we need, after all, theories of static equilibrium to understand some of the most important aspects of the market process as such. So today we're going to move to dynamic forces to see how entrepreneurship is defined, while concentrating on the contributions of Vetter, Wicksteed, Knight. Especially Knight is interesting here. We're going to spend a lot of time once again dealing with Frank Knight. That guy was kind of important in the history of this psychological school. And interestingly enough, we will add here one more kind of preemptive shot, so to speak, about one school of thought that we will mention, that we will study towards the end of the semester. Here we will involve then Chicago School of Economics. Chicago School of Economics and their theories about entrepreneurship and the firm. And here I have in mind primarily people like Jensen and Eugene Fama. So you'll see that their theories are in certain connection with the psychological school theories. After all, I'll tell you that Frank Knight was a professor of economics at the University of Chicago, and many of those guys, they're younger, Jensen, Fama, Demsetz, and others who contributed to the theory of the firm. They were students of Frank Knight. All of them were big admirers of Frank Knight. But that's one of the paradoxes of the history of modern economic ideas, that Frank Knight is very often referred to as the grand old man of the Chicago School, because he was the most important professor of economics at the University of Chicago at the beginning when the university was formed. You know who was responsible for the formation of the University of Chicago? John D. Rockefeller. It's a relatively new university formed in the late 19th century. So Frank Knight was, for one time, the only professor of economics there, and he taught generations of students down there at the University of Chicago. And because of his institutional affiliation with the University of Chicago, he's very often considered as a member of the Chicago School of Economics, which is a different thing. There is quite a bit of overlap, but those are not the same things. In reality, Frank Knight is as much a member of the Chicago School as it is of the Hungarian Austrian School, and I tried in this book to demonstrate that he's maybe even more substantively tied to the Hungarian school, to the Austrian school. So you know this, the Austrian or Viennese school is at cross purposes with the Chicago school. Chicago school that has different facets. Milton Friedman, George Stigler, those are some of the names in Chicago school. That's macroeconomic side of the Chicago school. And there is also this microeconomic approach, kind of finance theory of the firm corporate governance branch. It's Jensen, Eugene Fama. Armen Alchian and Harold Denzitz also belong to this, to the Chicago school, although they taught at another university. It's the University of UCLA in Chicago, but they studied UCLA in Los Angeles, but they studied in Chicago and they're very much influenced by its teachings. So we'll also mention those kinds of interconnections between the two schools of thought. So now we deal with one tricky concept which is much used and abused in modern economic literature, that everybody likes to like, nobody hates, but it is very poorly understood. Or one of the main problems that you might have with the scientific concept is that you cannot define it. Or however you try to define it, you're in trouble. So entrepreneurship, I think that the first who used the term was Turgot, the 18th century. The original meaning, you find the term even before then, but the idea was to describe the activity of the owners of capital who try to produce and sell something on the market. It unites in itself two distinct functions that we nowadays can talk of as distinct functions. So, entrepreneurship, this capitalist function, capitalist or investment function. That means people who save money and invest money are entrepreneurs. So this capitalist function is associated with risk-taking. Saving and risk-taking. That's what capitalists do. So saving means postponing consumption, sacrificing present goods in exchange for future goods. Risk-taking means we live in the conditions of uncertainty, and somebody has to bear the cost of uncertainty, and that's the entrepreneur. You invest in some business enterprise, the failure or success of that business enterprise is not a foregone conclusion. So the residual risk taker, as we say, the person who bears the ultimate responsibility for the success is the entrepreneur, is the capitalist investor. So we typically think of capitalist as the owner of the firm, the owners of the firm. So the original concept of entrepreneurship involved both this capitalist function and something more. What do you think? What else entrepreneurship involves? Clark talks about that last time. Pretty much everybody who tries to define entrepreneurship talks about this aspect of the entrepreneurial function.
We talked about like what, at least from the text they talked about here, like what's form of income? Is it wages or interest? Or
yeah.
profit?
Okay. So that's one aspect of it. What kind of income? That's one question here. What kind of income accrues to entrepreneur? What does that imply? What kind of income accrues to a capitalist investor? Say profit or interest, depending. Entrepreneurial profit. Profit or interest. But can an entrepreneur receive some other type of compensation?
Yeah.
What kind of compensation? In addition to interest or profit? Depending on terminology, Clark would say that it's interest. For the profit, in order to distinguish Knight would also say, would wages be entrepreneurial compensation? That's the trick. The original formulation of the concept of entrepreneurship assumed that the two basic functions, the capitalist function and organizing or managerial function, were united in the hands of the same person. The same person is the owner of the firm and the decision maker about what is to be done with capital and labor, how the firm is going to invest, and what the firm is going to produce, how much, and so on. This managerial or organizational or organizing function. So the concept of entrepreneurship comes from this world of relatively simple type of business enterprises in which the ownership capitalist investment functions, that's one and the same thing, is united with the managerial function. There is no separation of ownership and control. That's a term that we call separation. So in an entrepreneurial firm, as Turgot and Cantillon and early economists talk about, there is no separation of ownership and control. Whoever owns the firm, whoever owns the capital of the firm, makes decisions about how the capital is going to be used. So essentially we can say that there are two distinct problems with entrepreneurship that we have to answer, or maybe three, depending how you look. First is the what question. What entrepreneurs do? What is the most correct description of the entrepreneurial activities, irrespective of who does it, who performs the activity? You will see, I will list you 5 or 6 completely distinct definitions. Sometimes it cross purposes with each other, sometimes in contradiction with each other, sometimes difficult to reconcile. Let's put it that way. That's the what question, and finally the who question. Who is the entrepreneur? In a single entrepreneurial firm in which there is no separation of ownership and control, it's clear who is the entrepreneur. The owner is the entrepreneur. And the owner, you're my employees. I make decisions about what you're going to do, how am I going to organize my factors of production. I sell the product. I take risk. If the firm fails, I'm going to be losing investment, not you. I make decisions about what is going to be produced, how, with which production techniques, and so on and so forth. But now it gets trickier when we enter the modern world of publicly owned corporations, in which there is a separation of ownership and control. You know who coined this phrase, separation of ownership and control? I mentioned this when we in micro classes. Two guys called Berlin and Mies, who wrote a book about the modern corporation in 1935. That was highly critical of modern corporation, arguing that this is the death knell of entrepreneurship, the modern corporation, in which you have one group of people controlling the stock of the company, being the owners of the company, and on the other end, the spectrum, you have people who control the decision-making process, who decide what is going to be done with the stock, with the capital goods the firm owns, managers. And I said this is a problem because it creates the conflict of interest between capitalists and managers. Capitalists have what is the goal of owners, capitalists, investors? In a conventionally understood corporation, not in the social responsibility type theory nowadays, but the conventional corporation. What shareholders want to achieve? Yeah, maximize profit. Yeah. What is the goal function of managers? What is the legal institutional status of managers in modern open corporation in principle? They're paid employees in most cases. So as a paid employee, you don't necessarily share the goals of the owners of the company to maximize profit. So now there is a conflict of interest. And the problem is that people who seem to make the most vital decisions about how the firm's capital is going to be used are not interested in making profit. That might not be their primary goal. And Berlin Means said that this is a problem which will doom eventually the corporation because it represents a moral hazard. People who don't have the best interest of the corporate profitability are people who are making all crucial decisions. And there is no good way for the owners in a modern, highly decentralized, highly fragmented corporation with thousands of people sharing the ownership in it to control the managers. So managers have a certain ability here to misappropriate the ownership of the corporation for their own selfish purposes, for increasing their salaries and or their other benefits, while not maximizing profit of the firm. So they're organizing and managing, they're performing managerial function in a firm, but they're not performing the risk-taking function. Risk still remains with the owners. So in this splitting up in the concept of entrepreneurship now, what used to be unified, risk-taking, uncertainty-bearing, as Frank Knight says, function, and managerial functions are now bifurcated into two distinct functions. And there seems to be a conflict of interest between the two, and how to reconcile it. So that's the origin of the modern problem of entrepreneurship. It's easy to think of entrepreneurship when you have a small mom and pop shop or a small firm in which 3 partners are running the show. Then it's clear who does what. There is no high degree of separation between decision making and ownership or capitalist functions. So you can treat a capitalist function involves investment and ownership. And capitalist investors want to maximize profit. So in that kind of firm, you don't have a problem in principle, but you do have a problem with a modern, big, large corporation. and then how to think about entrepreneurship in the context of a modern corporate firm. So that's one issue. How do you do as a modern corporation? How to think about entrepreneurship in a modern corporation. So now you have to decide if you want to keep the concept of entrepreneurship. You have to decide, what do you mean by entrepreneurship? Do you mean a risk-taking function or managerial function? You cannot use it for both because they don't go hand in hand anymore. So then if you, for some strange reason, want to keep the concept of entrepreneurship, you have to decide what do you mean by entrepreneurship. Which one of these two? Or maybe both. Say then, risk-taking entrepreneurship or managerial entrepreneurship. But then, you see, if you want to use the term in that way, doesn't offer much analytical benefit, because you want to use a word when a word performs a certain function, helps you to clarify something, to explain something. You're just muddying the water here. You're just multiplying the words to explain the phenomena. You don't need the concept of entrepreneurship. If the word has two different meanings in two different contexts, why would you be using that word? So that's a problem, how to think of entrepreneurship in the context of a modern corporate firm. And it is connected then to the issue, who is the entrepreneur? That's, depending how you solve this dilemma here, you will then solve the problem of who is the entrepreneur. So obviously there are two possibilities here. You can either say, whoever is a residual risk taker, whoever is a capitalist is the entrepreneur, and nobody else is the entrepreneur. You want to amputate the managerial component of the entrepreneurial function and to say management doesn't belong to entrepreneurship. That's one possibility. Some very well-regarded economists take this road. We will see that Frank Knight, in one of his book chapters, takes this approach. And Ludwig von Mises follows him, and Murray Rothbard, and many other modern economists follow this. So entrepreneurship has to do with this, forget about management. Management is just a less important routine function that paid employee perform. Or alternatively, you can say, forget about capitalist function. Entrepreneurial function simply means it's the managerial function of organizing production process. So whoever performs the managerial / organizational function is the entrepreneur. It doesn't matter whether that's a paid employee of a corporation or the owner of the corporation. Whoever controls the firm's decision-making process about what is going to be produced and how is the entrepreneur. And then we go back to what Royce mentioned, the type of compensation. The type of compensation or a return to the entrepreneurial function will depend how you define entrepreneurship within this context. If you say the entrepreneur is almost always a capitalist, as Ludwig von Mises and his followers do, including one of my teachers, Peter Klein, then profit or interest is the only compensation. So interest is a compensation for the entrepreneurial function. Salary cannot be a component of the entrepreneurial income. Salary rewards routine labor activities, including the management activities. Or if you accept this elastic concept of entrepreneurship that says whoever performs the management function, whatever combination of interest and wage income that person receives, is his entrepreneurial income. So that's the wrote that Frank Knight in his book Risk, Uncertainty and Profit. Takes in chapter 9 of that book that I highly recommend to you. He says literally, he offers a historical overview of how the entrepreneurial function evolved. He said, usually when a firm is small and simple, entrepreneurial income comes from profit. Because one person or a couple of owners control the business operation, and they unite in their own hands both capitalist function, risk-taking, as well as managerial function. They both organize production and invest, finance production. But once a company becomes more complicated, once it grows in size, and especially when it comes to corporations, things become more complicated. And he says it's typically the combination of, I'll read you just one segment, one consequence. See on the page 155, you have this quotation from Frank Knight's book at the top of the page. The character of the entrepreneur's income is evidently complex, and the relation of its component elements subtle. It contains an element which is ordinary contractual income, received on the ground of routine services performed by the entrepreneur personally for the business wages or earned by property which belongs to him. So you see, he says that the entrepreneurial income could be partially paid in wages, insofar as an entrepreneur is a paid employee of the company. It says further down the page, it is rare that a hired entrepreneur, you see, he's talking about a hired entrepreneur. Okay. Who is a hired entrepreneur? A manager. Receives a contractual income as his only interest in the business. What he wants to say here, that it's very rarely that the top level manager will only receive wages. Very often he will have some kind of stock option or some vested interest into the profitability of the firms. He will be given some ownership. He's usually a part owner, or at least his salary is so adjusted as to make it clear that his continuance in the position is contingent upon its prosperity under his direction. So he says, yeah, the salary is a part of the entrepreneurial income, but other things are as well. It's rarely just a fixed salary. It's just rarely contractual income is just a name for another name for a salary, for a regular wage contract. Contractual income is a salary. Non-contractual income is what depends on risk-taking and uncertainty. So profit and interest are non-contractual incomes. You invest in a firm, it's not clear that you can get profit. You cannot insure your profit because it's highly uncertain whether you're going to succeed or not. You cannot make a contract with somebody to pay you profit. We will see why is that. Frank Knight, one of the topics of this book is a relationship between uncertainty and profit. That profit is a compensation for dealing with uncertainty. So you see then that entrepreneurial function is broken down into the two component parts, managerial component and capitalist component as well. And here's Frank Knight seems to believe that this managerial component should be identified with entrepreneurship. And as you read the chapter later on, and you'll see that Frank Fetter and Philip Wicks did agree with this as well. Definition of entrepreneurship as the organizational managerial activity. Okay, any questions thus far? Okay, so that's one aspect of the problem. So this is Frank Knight, and Frank Knight is a strange guy. He was a very highly eclectic thinker, which means that he was not, he combined different influences in his theory that were not always, excuse me, not always, let's say, perfectly reconciled within his own thought. And this is a strange case. This masterpiece, Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit. That's a book that he had written when he was a graduate student. This was his doctoral dissertation. And in that doctoral dissertation, he had 9 chapters in the book, in the dissertation. This chapter that I just read a few paragraphs to you was the last chapter in the book. However, when he published his dissertation as a book, he added 2 additional chapters that were not in the original dissertation. And chapter 10 is a real stumbling block here, because that chapter 10, he essentially offers completely different and contradictory conception of entrepreneurship that will be picked up later on by Ludwig von Mises, by Murray Rothbard, by the entire modern Austrian school of economics. They will pick up this formulation of the problem of entrepreneurship in chapter 10. And in chapter 10, what Knight does, he completely turns the table, flips it upside down. He says, this is not entrepreneurship at all. This is just a routine activity. This is the real entrepreneurship. What I mean by real entrepreneurship is actually risk-taking, uncertainty bearing. And only the owners perform the risk-taking or uncertainty bearing function. So then a paid employee cannot be the entrepreneur at all. Says on page 156, this quotation from Knight. The paradox of the hired manager, whom he in the previous chapter described as a hired entrepreneur. You see the slight shift in terminology. He's not talking about a manager anymore as a hired entrepreneur. He's a hired manager now, which has caused endless confusion in the analysis of profit, arises from the failure to recognize the fundamental fact that in organized activity, the crucial decision is the selection of men to make decisions. That any other sort of decision making, listen to this, any other sort of decision making or exercise of judgment is automatically reduced to a routine function. So you know what does that mean? It says the only selection of men to make decisions. What is that? Within a corporation. Hiring the managers. Hiring and firing the managers, that's the only entrepreneurial function. Everything else is a routine activity. So you have one concept here that Knight insists on. This is important. I have to make a slight intermezzo here before we return back to hired managers and entrepreneurs. Okay, so remember that. Just a small qualification here, the concept of judgment. Judgment, according to Knight, is the crucial characteristic of entrepreneurial function, entrepreneurial activity. What is judgment? Judgment is a characteristic of the decision-making process in conditions of uncertainty. So judgment is connected with the concept of uncertainty. What is uncertainty? Uncertainty is something fundamentally different from risk. According to Knight, you see risk, uncertainty, and profit. That he distinguishes between risk and uncertainty. Judgment is a decision-making ability that you need to have in a situation in which you cannot calculate the probability of something happening. This is called incalculable risk. So that's the situation that a modern firm faces. Situation of uncertainty. What is the difference between risk and uncertainty? Risk is a kind of uncertainty that could be mathematically modeled. It could be the probability of an event could be calculated. An obvious example is a roll of a dice. See, if you make enough rolls, the likelihood of number 2 showing up would be exactly 1/6. If you repeat the process enough time, it will show up exactly 1/6 of the time. In insurance business, you are dealing with risk. You can insure people against car accident or against fire or against any number of other things because you can put an individual event in a context of other similar events that can happen, and then you can calculate the frequency of such an occurrence happening. Certain class of events happen, and then you can calculate what is the probability that a young man of 25 years old will have a car accident that will wreck his car. How many young men 25 years old with cars in America, such and such number, how many on average car accidents like that happen, whatever it is, you divide two numbers, you get your probability. You use this implicit probability as a basis for charging the risk premium. So you can insure yourself against the car accident because a car accident is a type of event that could be put in the relationship with other homogeneous events, or the other events of the same character. And the probability of an individual event could be calculated mathematically. That's risk. Risk is something that you can determine in principle, at least the probability of. That's called one American mathematician of Austrian ancestry, actually younger brother of Ludwig von Mises, called Richard von Mises. He was a pioneer in this theory. He called this class probability. Class probability. That's a probability of a class of events. Car accidents that a 25-year-old man have, or probability that a young woman of 20 years of age will die of cancer, will have cancer, is far lower than the probability that an older man of 65 years old who smokes will get cancer. So you can calculate both of them. That's the reason why in a free market health insurance system, a young woman of 20 years will pay a far lower risk, far lower insurance premium than a 65 years old man, because you can put both of their risks into the context of mathematical calculation. You can calculate the principal probability of an adverse event happening. And you have a case probability. And this is the problem. Case probability is what Knight calls uncertainty. That's a situation in which you are lost at sea. You don't know how to evaluate the likelihood of something happening. You have no mathematical algorithm for calculating probability of an event. Whether a firm is going to go bankrupt or not, you cannot decide that by calculation. If you cannot calculate the probability of something, then what can you do? You can use your common sense, your good judgment, your intuition, your educated guess, whatever you want to call it, to bet on an event, to bet on a given firm. The more you know about the business, you can have a better judgment about whether to invest in this company or in that company. So judgment is a quality that you need to perform the entrepreneurial function, capitalist function, which Frank Knight in chapter 10 identifies. Entrepreneurial function equals capitalist function. Contra chapter 9. Judgment is a key hallmark of entrepreneurship. So what, according to Knight, is judgment? Who? The owner. The owner capitalist. As we've seen, he says, hired manager is just an employee. Hired manager is an employee. Only the owner exercises judgment. I'll read it once again. The paradox of the hired manager, which has caused endless confusion in the analysis of profit, arises from the failure to recognize the fundamental fact that in organized activity, meaning the kind of business corporate activity, organized activity, the crucial, there's no ambiguity of any kind, crucial, italicized, underlined, decision is the selection of men to make decisions. That any other sort of decision-making or exercise of judgment is automatically reduced to a routine function. It's not a subject matter of entrepreneurship. So the only, your judgment where to invest in, your judgment whom to hire, whom to fire. That's entrepreneurship. Everything else that we usually think of as entrepreneurship is just a routine activity. Directly contrary to what he said in the previous chapter 9. And directly contrary to what Fetter and Wicksteed also said. What do you think about this? Which of these two solutions seems more promising?
Let's say the one that says that the manager is just an employee, it's not an entrepreneur.
He's not the entrepreneur. Okay. Why is that? Why do you think that's a better model of thinking about entrepreneurship?
I'd say just based on like the context, like what you said is just like the entrepreneur's real responsibility is like hiring the manager, while the manager's responsibility is like to listen to the entrepreneur. And I don't know. I just think that the managers have like a higher turnover rate than like entrepreneurs.
Okay. Others? Even the top level managers, you see, it's not just the managers, the low level or mid level managers. Everybody, a CEO of a company is not technically an entrepreneur. Okay, what is the cost of that solution if we decide to go that way? What is the loss in explanatory power, as we like to say? It's the power of our categories to explain the world. Sometimes the easiest check is how does this differ from the ordinary use of language. What do you know about Elon Musk? Do you consider Elon Musk an entrepreneur?
does he technically, he doesn't own all of Tesla, so he's technically not really an entrepreneur.
If I ask you, if you ask 100 people who know anything about Elon Musk, what do you think? What the answer would be? That he's an entrepreneur. It's a quintessential entrepreneur. He doesn't own a single stock, or maybe he's a minority stockholder. I don't know whether he. I think that he doesn't own actually shares in Tesla at all. But he's not. He's very far from being a majority stockholder. Simple. So now the price is that somebody like Elon Musk would be a person who performs a routine function, according to Frank Knight, in the Tesla company. Really? Another example that I use here, that's older generation, you've probably heard of somebody called Michael Milken. Michael Milken was the junk bond king, the junk bond king of 1980s. What that guy did? No, he was not Wall Street based. That's interesting. He was based in California. He was a kind of poor kid from a poor to middle class family who studied in some relatively obscure schools, mastered business administration degree from some middling university, no major Ivy League pedigree, no father in some New York investment bank or anything like that. He was the guy who financed the hostile takeovers in 1980s. So you know what hostile takeovers are?
Pretty much just when a company outright buys the majority of the shares.
Yeah. So why would who is buying the company?
Like another company, like a competitor.
Yeah, or some outside investor. What is the purpose of the? Why is it called the hostile takeover? What is the purpose of the action? Who is the target of the operation? Yeah, the existing, the incumbent management. So the goal is you have this separation of ownership and control. If a firm is badly mismanaged, its profitability is very low, then I buy the firm, 51%, I fire the management, I replace it with a better new management, I restructure the firm, and then do whatever needs to be done, increase profitability, maybe scale back the operation, maybe reduce, eliminate some unprofitable parts of the firm, whatever. And then once profitability increases, I sell it and pocket the difference here. That's the operation. It's one of the mechanisms for corporate governance, for control of the managerial discussions. So if you're a manager and you underperform and the profitability and the share price is very low, you may end up as a victim of a hostile takeover bid. Somebody might buy 51% and then fire. Now the problem with this is that this is an awfully expensive procedure. So in order to buy 51%, you have to offer a substantially higher price to shareholders to convince them to sell. It's a huge amount of money. Most entrepreneurs do not have, most of those takeover entrepreneurs do not have enough money to buy that. So they go to people like Michael Milken for money. And how he provides cheap sources of money with junk bonds. Very high rate of return, has a very good connections and very good in bond investment. So he was capable, he developed a stellar reputation for delivering huge amount of money on a very short notice to those takeover entrepreneurs. He was employed by a small investment bank called Drexel and Burnham, operating out of small office in San Jose or something, California, in the middle of nowhere. His labor contract was that he receives $100,000 per year and was given percentage of every deal that he makes. He didn't care about profitability of the investment, what they do with the money in Drexel Burnham, how they invest, whom they hire, how they operate the firm. He didn't care at all. He was just like a state within a state. He had his own office within Drexel Burnham, and he did his own thing. Now, if you accept Frank Knight's definition from Chapter 10, then Michael Milken was not an entrepreneur either. He just received the combination of fixed and flexible wage income, percentage of the sold. If you have a regular book dealer or somebody who sells sells for somebody else, distributes goods, you might have the same. You might have the same model of compensation. 10% of every book that you sell goes to you. When I was very young, I used to work as a student for a while as a kind of street bookseller. I was going from one firm to another selling books. It was a tough time, and I've had that kind of 20% of every book that you sell, you receive. That's essentially the same business model, the same contractual scheme that Michael Milken worked with. Was Michael Milken? Michael Milken was one of the wealthiest people in America in the 1980s. He eventually ended up in jail with trumped-up accusations of securities fraud by the New York branch of the Department of Justice. So New York was the Southern District of New York branch of the Department of Justice, indicted by a very popular prosecutor called Rudolph Giuliani at that time, and his deputy, even younger and also very famous prosecutor known as James Comey. So, working together. A surprise. So, that surprise that you have plenty of people like Elon Musk or Michael Milken who are quintessential entrepreneurs. Some of them are creative geniuses that revolutionized. Michael Milken revolutionized the way how business was done. The wave of hostile takeovers was instrumental in increasing the profitability of American industry by shaking up the inefficient corporations and banks, by making them more vulnerable to hostile takeover attacks, by reducing the costs of hostile takeovers, making money more readily available to hostile takeover entrepreneurs. So the source of money is actually, I borrow money from you, you're Michael Milken, I'm hostile takeover entrepreneur. I buy the firm, I do whatever I need to do, I resell it then, and I give you 20%, 30% of my profit in 1 year. Or I pay you a fixed sum of money sometimes. After 6 months, I pay you $5 million, or maybe at the signing of the contract. All kinds of arrangements are possible. So that's one of the problems here, is that you can do this trick that Frank Knight did, to say entrepreneurship means just ownership and selection of managers, residual risk taking, and nothing else. Everything else is a routine activity. But the price that you pay for that is that there is an awful lot of economic activity that we usually associate with entrepreneurship and consider to be a part of entrepreneurship that you cannot explain. What is that? Or Elon Musk and Michael Milken performing routine activities. So we don't want to go too much into the details about Wicksteed and Fetter. You will see easily that they take the opposite route, that they take this route of identifying managerial function with entrepreneurship. Wicksteed talks about the undertaker. By the way, undertaker now sounds slightly awkward when you use it in English language because of this association with funeral services. But undertaker is just a literal translation of entrepreneur. Entrepreneur is a Latin stem. It stems from French. Undertaker, literally. So he says, undertaker is whoever who is undertaking an undertaking. If it's a paid employee, he is an undertaking. If it's the owner of the company, depending on the ownership structure and legal status of the entity in question, both employee and the employer could be entrepreneurs. And Fetter does the same thing. You see, on page 160, Wicksteed, how sharply he distinguishes between management and ownership, and how sharply he focuses on, identifies management with undertaking. This separate paragraph here. We find him, undertaker, making bargains with those who control the several factors of production, which means making bargains with workers, with others. Some of them will receive fixed payments or promises and will have no further claims on the concern. On this method, he may secure raw material, labor, machinery, and land, and may pay some part of the necessary premium for waiting. That's interest, the bench. Others will take or share the risk and will give their cooperation on an expectation as to the result, their respective claim on which are suitably defined. You see now, entrepreneur, the undertaker takes the center stage here, the organizer of the production process. And he sees a firm. You see how different the image of a corporation is here. He makes bargains with workers, you see, with the sellers of raw material, labor, machinery, and land. And others will take or share the risk and will give their cooperation on the expectation as to the result. So he will then make contracts with people who finance the business operation with capitalists. So see, capitalists are almost a subsidiary here. Entrepreneur makes contracts with the laborers, with the sellers of raw material, and also with capitalists for whom he gets the money, and he uses the money to produce whatever he produces, and then capitalists are entitled on their residual income, profit. Or the undertaker himself may take some or all of the risk. See, it's perfectly okay. If the firm is a small firm in which there is no separation of ownership and control, undertaker will take some or all risk for himself. But he doesn't have to. If there is a separation of risk-taking and management, the undertaker entrepreneur is the manager. Capitalist is a separate factor. Or the undertaker himself may take some or all of the risks for himself, for he may be his own capitalist. He may be his own capitalist, which means that he himself may finance his operation. Or he may be employed at a fixed salary by those who take the risk as a manager. In any case, on his own account or on the account of his employers, he will make whatever initial bargains have to be made and will then direct and combine the several factors and determine their respective amounts. We'll make decisions about everything. So you see how different the picture of the economic process of the entrepreneurial decision-making is this. Here the undertaker is center stage, and what he does is the crucial. It's not a routine activity. It's the crucial activity. And what Frank Knight in chapter 10 describes as the crucial activity of an entrepreneur, to decide who is going to perform the managerial function, here is described as entrepreneur finding somebody, hiring, in a certain sense, somebody to give him the money to carry out his own plans. See, it's not that capitalists are hiring managers. It's rather that the undertaker is finding somebody to give him the money to fulfill his plans. And Fetter does pretty much the same. He enters also the. Yeah, one other example. Yeah, go ahead, Bart.
Recent analysis, Elon Musk would be the undertaker.
Yeah, right. Elon Musk is the undertaker. That's the idea.
And then the shareholders of people.
Shareholders are people who fit the bill, who finance his undertaking. But interestingly enough, there's the guy Sam Walton. Sam Walton is also an undertaker. Why? Because Sam Walton is his own entrepreneur, his own capitalist. I'm sorry. Other people who was, let's say, John D. Rockefeller. He was largely his own capitalist. He saved some money and started, and then his firm started growing and so on. So internal growth of a firm is possible.
Would Knight say that someone like Rockefeller was more of an entrepreneur?
Frank Knight would say Frank Knight from Chapter 10, sorry to say, would say, no, Elon Musk is not an entrepreneur. Elon Musk is performing. He would be forced to say that. I don't know whether he would have said that, but the correct and consistent application of his logic would force him to say that Elon Musk is not an entrepreneur.
But he would say someone like Rockefeller was.
Rockefeller was, insofar as he financed his own business operation. Yeah, Rockefeller was. But you see then the problem. It's not when you use a certain term as an explanatory variable, as something that you use to explain other things. It's not good if you can explain only 30% of the cases or 50% of the cases. So explanatory value means how much of the universe of the things that you want to explain your explanation covers. So in this particular case, Wiksted's model explains everything. For Wiksted, both Elon Musk and Michael Milken and John D. Rockefeller and Sam Walton, the owner of Walmart, all of them are entrepreneurs in their own distinct ways. For Frank Knight, only Walton and Rockefeller are entrepreneurs. So Fetter adds another issue here. Imagine a bank. So then a small shareholder would be an entrepreneur, and Elon Musk wouldn't be. You see how disproportionate all of this. A bank. Who is the entrepreneur in a major commercial bank? If Frank Knight's theory is correct, every one of us, everyone who keeps some money in a bank, or shareholders, stockholders, who is making decisions are people who, the officers, administrative officers of the bank. So it's the confidence and support of lenders, whether banks, individual shareholders, or investors in bonds, must be secured by the management. Good judgment of the money market often is as vital as judgment of the market for the particular product. That's page 167, Fetter saying. That's a managerial function. To secure the confidence and support of lenders, banks, individual shareholders, or investors in bonds. Good judgment of the money market often is as vital as judgment of the market for a particular product. It's not only consumers, but also financiers and lenders, people who give you the money. So you see, according to Fetter, you have both productive entrepreneurship, which means organizing production process. So the invention of the assembly line would be an entrepreneurial process of vertical integration in the Rockefeller's case, whatever Jeff Bezos did. What is Jeff Bezos? Can somebody tell me? What is his major contribution, his entrepreneurial innovation? What did he do? The Amazon, what is the main source of their money?
Shipping.
Yeah, shipping, I don't know, maybe leveraging modern technology to replace the regular retail, brick and mortar retail. That's
You do a lot of like web businesses.
yeah, website online stuff and using shipping as a cheap alternative to traditional brick and mortar stores. That's Bill Gates also. It's most obvious. All of us are now beneficiaries of Bill Gates's entrepreneurial innovation. So now it comes all of this that we discussed, creative destruction and so on. That could be another aspect of what they do. They make judgment in order to make profit, and they create and destroy stuff in the process and so on. But who are they? According to this Fetter, Wicksteed, Frank Knight, number 9, chapter 9, theory, whoever happens to think is the entrepreneur. We cannot say from first principles who is that going to be. Okay, let's finish off then just with a few thoughts about this Chicago theory school. Traditional view of the problem of separation of ownership and control is that this represents a problem. This is something undesirable which has social costs and has to be taken care of somehow. Some mechanisms for controlling the discretion of managers have to be brought to bear. And then there are different mechanisms. The share price sends the information to shareholders about the relative validity of what the management does. They can then sell shares and put the pressure on managers. Then you have other things like concentration of ownership, that management is not performing well, a couple of people control 51%, they can hire and fire management. Then you have hostile takeovers that we just discussed. You can have then the stock options. You give the partial ownership to the managers, so they then have a vested interest in increasing the rate of return, increasing profit, because it will affect their own portfolio, their own investment, and so on. And what Jensen and Fama and other members of the Chicago School say, that this is not quite the correct way of looking at the problem of what corporations do, because there are positive benefits of the positive reasons why we do have separation of ownership and control. This fragmentation of ownership has distinct benefits as well. And this is interesting. Instead of being a boon to the managers, instead of enabling this opportunistic behavior by managers, is a check on their opportunistic behavior. The fact that ownership is widely spread across different firms and fragmented is a controlling mechanism of managers. How does that work? That's a portfolio theory that Eugene Fama got the Nobel Prize in economics for, eventually. Portfolio theory. Portfolio theory says that an optimal profit maximizing strategy for an individual investor is not to concentrate your ownership into 1 or 2 or 3 different types of securities, but to try to make a nice cross-section of the entire market. try to diversify your holdings, not to put all eggs into one basket, as the proverb would have it. So a typical trade-off that you face as an individual investor is that any given security has the risk and variance correlated, which means higher the risk, higher the rate of return. But then the higher the uncertainty about the outcome will be. If you have a higher opportunity to earn an above average profit rate, you have a higher probability or the expectation of a loss. So portfolio theory allows you to retain relatively high level of return while minimizing the variance. How do we minimize the variance? By simply bundling together a bunch of shares that are not correlated in different industries. So if any one of them, if you have 25 or 30 of them together, some of them will go up and down, but not all of them will go down together or up together, unless you have a recession, unless you have this autocorrelation. If you have something systemic that happens that will lead to a drop in share prices for every single security. So then you have retain a relatively high rate of return while avoiding the high risk, individual risk. The risk of a portfolio, total portfolio, is far lower than the risk of any one individual security. You don't care about any one individual security. You care about the average rate of return in the basket of securities. That's a very convenient. That's something that every individual investor wants to engage in. The portfolio managers is a new occupation in our business. Now, one of the consequences of that is that the financial market is highly flexible. People are buying and selling shares in different companies daily. Capital is flowing in and out individual corporations on a daily basis. The transaction costs of buying and selling and shifting your ownership from one type of equity to another type of equity, from one corporation to another corporation, are very low now. And that's bad news for managers. Because then the sensitivity of the financial market to the performance, to the underperformance by managers is much higher. So then, yes, managers have the ability to rip off the owners by working for themselves rather than by securing profit for the corporation. That's correct. But also on the flip side of that, the owners have the ability to take care of themselves by simply selling their shares. I, as individual owner, have a very low stake in a company. If I see that company A is performing poorly because of the management, I just sell the shares. And if enough people sell, the share price will go down. The costs for me are very low. The costs for the individual investor are very low. So then individual investors have the ability to punish managers very easily by buying or selling shares. So then this fragmentation of ownership is not a problem that requires solution at all. It's a feature, not a bug. It's something that exerts discipline over the management rather than imposing the costs. And they conclude finally, Fama and Jensen, that we don't need the concept of entrepreneurship at all. Their final solution is actually that we have a risk-taking and management functions that are separate. In a modern firm, they define a firm as a nexus of contracts. It's just a legal fiction. That's another term. It's a legal fiction. Corporation, a firm, is just a legal fiction when different groups of people make contracts about the exchange of different types of resources. So then, who would be the entrepreneur? There is no entrepreneur in a modern corporation. You have a risk takers, shareholders, and you have the managers. You don't need anything to tie them together, it says. This theory abolishes the entrepreneur as a category. Okay, we're already out of time. Any final questions? Okay, start sending me if you already thought of your paper topics and so on. You can slowly start putting something on paper and sending it my way just to see where you are going. Or if you want to discuss it in person with me, drop by whenever you can during my office hours. And that would be it. Also, have a nice weekend. And I'll see you on Tuesday.